Matthew chapter 25. As you're turning there, I want to make just a quick note of a few things. Number one, we are going to have a special class starting on Wednesdays this quarter. Lest everyone get too excited, it is a very specialized class based on invite and all. It is a beginner's class to John, and there's two goals with that. Number one, if you are a biblical novice and you think you need to sign up for a beginner's class in the Gospel of John, it's for you. If you have taught John or you think that doesn't apply to you, it probably doesn't, but you are welcome, and then we'll just politely tell you to leave when you get there. But the second thing, and actually moreover to why it is a beginner's course in John, is this is set up for people to invite their friends and family, their co-workers and everyone on Wednesday nights. The class is set up entirely for the idea that if someone were to come in for one class, for one session, for one quarter, this would be the place for them to learn in an environment that is conducive to their success. This isn't for our 20th round of John. This is for someone who maybe has never heard or certainly hasn't been in a Bible class like this to just move through the chapters of the Gospel of John. If you have any questions all about that, please feel free to ask me, and we will discuss what the plans are, who's teaching when, and what we are covering. Again, that is the Gospel of John. We're going to do the best we can to cover that in the 12 Wednesday nights that we have without singings, but that is the goal there. Now, also, as a matter of fact, tomorrow night, of course, is the big game that's going to separate one person from the other. A finalist in our group is Andrew Bowie and Sam Kerr. I'm going to give you 1 second to think about that and tell Bowie, it was nice knowing you. No one's rooting for you. So we will see how that goes. We're thankful that Bowie gave a good Lord's Supper talk, even if his language was a little bit on the aggressive side. We will be rooting for Sam tomorrow. Matthew chapter 25. There's a lot of things going on, a lot of things that we know that we're used to. Parable of Talents is one of those. It's not like the Gospel of John. We've heard it so many times. So I want to think from a little bit of a different perspective as Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven beginning in verse 14. It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. Then he went away. He who had received the 5 talents went at once and traded with them, and he made 5 talents more. So also he had the 2 talents, made 2 talents more. But he who had received the 1 talent went and dug in the ground and hid his master's money. Now after a long time, the master of those servants came and settled accounts with them. He who had received the 5 talents came forward, bringing 5 talents more, saying, Master, you delivered to me 5 talents. Here, I have made 5 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. And he also, who had the 2 talents, came forward, saying, Master, you delivered to me 2 talents. Here, I have made 2 talents more. His master said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. He who had also received the 1 talent came forward, saying, Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. But his master answered him, You wicked and slothful servant. You knew that I reap where I have not sown, and gather where I scattered no seed. Then you ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest. So take the talent from him and give it to him who has the 10 talents. For to everyone who has will more be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away. And cast the worthless servant into the outer darkness, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. We read that, of course, it ends on a very dramatic note. That is there a judgment scene, and the 1 talent man has failed. And so he is receiving a poor or a frightening judgment. And we see earlier, of course, the 5 talent man and the 2 talent man, how they produce in their own kind. They basically double what they have been given. But our focus really isn't so much on the scariness of judgment. That really comes out in verses 31 through 46, where we're judged by our deeds, how we serve those who are in need. But 14 through 30 has a little bit of a different bend, and really it centers upon the master in the story, the one who is giving the talents, this instrument of money, and that, of course, is God. And the fact is, when we read Matthew 25, 14 through 30, we often think, of course, about ourselves. And I really think this parable, as Jesus is queuing up the kingdom of heaven, going back to chapter 25 and verse 1, there are a lot of lessons to be learned about God and his role in not only the judgment scene, the kingdom of heaven, but how he knows who we are and what we are capable of. Now, when we use the word talents, of course, in English, we think of abilities. That's really not the idea here. This is money, and there's just unbelievable deltas between what people think 1 talent is worth. But I find to be the most convenient and kind of the middle ground one is that 1 talent is about 16 years worth of work. So you can imagine the 5-talent man was given an extraordinary amount of money. And again, estimates range higher and lower than that. But the 1-talent man, even the 1-talent man, 16 years worth of pay is a lot to be a steward of. And if you think about this, going back to verse 14, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. That's what's really important here. As we discuss the parable of the talents, we need to see, first of all, this starts with one man, the master's money. It's his, and he's entrusting what is his to someone else. And he does this, verse 15 says explicitly, to each according to his ability. This is important because it establishes a couple things. Number one, this guy knew a lot of people. But number two, he differentiated between them. And this is the most shocking part of the story. None of them are recorded pointing to the other one and saying, that's not fair. Can you imagine? If you have multiple kids, can you imagine ever giving 1 5 of anything, 1 2 and 1 1, and no one saying that's not fair? Why did she get? Why did he get? I don't understand. The man understood this. It really didn't matter what the 5, 2, and 1 talent servants thought. The reality was he knew, the one who had all knowledge of who they were, what their strengths and weaknesses are in handling money and what their ability load was. He entrusted to 3 different stewards 3 different amounts of his money. And that is a reality that we have to face in life. There are differences among us, and that's going to come out as we move forward a little bit later in our study. But we need to stop pretending like we are all the same, as if we're identical carbon copies of one another. We are all equally amazing because we are made in the image of God. Not because of any skill set, not because of any money ability, but because we are made in the image of God. But that doesn't mean that, to Gary's point this morning in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we are all ears, we are all noses, or all feet. We all have different roles to play. And really, this bears out fruit. The servants are given 5, 2, and 1 because the master knows who they are. He, as we would say it, knows their strengths and weaknesses. And says, look, you can handle 5, you can handle 2, and you can handle 1. And by the way, he was right. If you look at this, the 5-talent man produces 5 more. The 2-talent produces 2 more, and the 1-talent man hid his. Now, you could call that perhaps a failure, and he's dealt with for that failure. But the master has an inclination that some of these can handle more than the others, and that was proven to be correct. The question isn't, is that right? It's, number one, will we acknowledge that fact? Number 2, will we acknowledge that that means that I have different roles to play than the person sitting next to me? And then number 3, what does God do with people who have different abilities, who have different talents, who can be a steward over more of what God has blessed us with, whether that be opportunity, finances, etc.? But what we see from the master here is that his judgment was just. When you look at this, the man who produced 5 talents, the one who produced 2, that's a gap. He clearly thought the 5-talent man could do more. I did not say better, and if I say better, what I mean is could produce more with what he had. And yet, even though one produced 5 more and one produced 2 more, when you look at the text in verse 21 and 23, the commendation from the God character in the parable is identical. In verse 21, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Verse 23, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over a little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. Now, we look at that and we say, wow. I mean, he made a judgment that one person was a 5-talent man and one was a 2. And yet, when they each produced what we would say the best that they could, the judgment is entirely just. In fact, you might argue that the reason it's just isn't because 5 and 2 are equal. They're not. It's because of the empathetic nature. That is, he understood that the 5-talent man could do more than the 2-talent man. If you think about this, really, in a vacuum, from a human point of view, this isn't just. We'd say, I want to hire the 5-talent guy. Would anyone in here say, I'm looking at this list, and I know I don't identify as the 5-talent person, but that's the one I want working. Does anyone choose number 2 or 1? No, of course not. We all want the 5-talent guy. Isn't it interesting? Isn't it amazing, then, that God, the master in this parable, can look at the 2-talent man and be thrilled with him like he is the 5-talent person? I think that's amazing. He can understand that we do have limitations, that we do have strengths that are different than others. We have weaknesses that are different. That means, by the way, not just that I have 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses, you have 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses. It might mean my weakness is worse than yours, and your strength is stronger than mine. And yet this master knows that. Going back again to verse 15, to one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. We have to trust that God knows us and can handle us with this type of just and empathetic nature. And of course, we are drawn to the end of this. So really in verse 25 through 30 is this terrible, horrific judgment that's cast on the 1 talent man who says, I was afraid. Master, I knew you to be a hard man, and so I just buried it. I didn't want to lose it. Here, you have what is yours. Burying the talent was not pleasing to the master. And even though he was just, even though he was empathetic, even though he knew the 1 talent man couldn't do what the 5 could, there is a severe judgment for falling short. So how do we process the fact that God knows who I am? He knows my strengths. He knows my weaknesses. He knows that some of us are 5, 2, and 1 talent people, and I want to make sure I'm not the one who's failing, because that's a serious judgment. Well, I think rather than just fixating on the negative, if we focus on the power of what God shows here, and the way he truly knows us as individual souls made in his image, I think this actually could be incredibly encouraging rather than discouraging, thinking I never quite do enough. Because number one, we learn God knows that somebody here is a 5-talent person. Okay? I just want to rip that Band-Aid off right now. Somebody in the room is a 5-talent person. Now you could just say, where's the 2-talent church? Maybe. But you've met someone who's a 5-talent person, and all of us can't, either out of humility or cowardice, claim to not be that guy. Because keep in mind, who determined who got the 5 talents, 2, and the 1? It wasn't them themselves. He didn't line them up and say, all right, I want to see what everyone wants to think about themselves. Who thinks they're a 5-talent person? All right, you get 5. Who thinks they're a 2-talent person? No, the master knows. And this should be, by the way, a good thing, that God knows who we are. But I think one of the reasons we don't talk about this is because, number one, who dares to, in a public group of people, say they're a 5-talent person? That's an immediate cause for the preacher to preach a lesson on pride. Right? You're going to immediately get X-nayed on that. Remember that, boo, if you win the bracket challenge. It is a pride problem to celebrate that way. But number two, it might be that we struggle with our own self-esteem. Not because we don't want to seem prideful, it's because we actually genuinely don't feel like we're that person. We'll talk about that as we go. But then third, I do think there's a third idea that, if I acknowledge that I'm a 5-talent opportunity person in God's sight as a steward, that's a lot more work than just being the 2-talent person, than being the 1-talent steward. It's easier to be the 1-talent steward who just needs to produce 1 more if the pattern were to hold, than it is to be the 5-talent person. Look with me in Luke chapter 12. Jesus talks a lot about this, and again, notice the idea of where the idea of being sorted is, being sorted into the category of ability. Luke chapter 12, of course, as Jesus is dealing with his common foes, the adversaries. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 48, he is responding to Peter. And of course, he's dealing with people who don't understand all that he's suggesting about coming forward and who he's picking. And his adversaries, the Pharisees, always wanted to be at the front. They always wanted to be the best. But notice this in Luke 12 and verse 42. The Lord said, "Who then is the faithful and wise manager whom his master will set over his household, to give them their portion of food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find doing so when he comes. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. But if that servant says to himself, the master is delayed in coming, and begins to beat the male and female servants and to eat and drink and get drunk, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the unfaithful. And that servant who knew his master's will but did not get ready or act according to his will receive a severe beating. But the one who did not know and did what deserved a beating will receive a light beating. Everyone to whom much was given, of him much will be required, and from him to whom they entrusted much they will demand the more." And most of us know the last part of verse 48 because it has made it into the American vernacular, essentially. To whom much is given, much is required. But even from a punishment standpoint, it's interesting in verse 48. Those who have less opportunity will be punished differently. I know it makes everyone uncomfortable, but that's what Jesus said. So what we again have to realize is it's not my choice which category of servant I place myself in. And again, this isn't about a lesson of fear. That's a takeaway from the parable of the talents. So this isn't our focus. The idea is that God does know. So number one, don't sell yourself short. Not because you are actually better than you think, but because you have value, because who? God placed it there by making you in his image. And in case that wasn't enough, God thought enough of you through your failure that he sent Jesus to die on the cross for my sins. When I was at my lowest, my weakest, when I was an enemy of God, Jesus died for me. Value is there. Parable of Talents often makes us think that word talent, abilities, and it comes out and we just start thinking, yeah, I can do more. I can do more. That's never been what this is about. Will I be a good steward of what God has given me? Because it's not about me. It's about God who gave it to me in the first place. And so we have to acknowledge somebody here is a 5-talent person. And by the way, if you don't consider yourself that, that may or may not be true. But realize that God knows whether it is or isn't. And it's not just how we feel or how we've acted. It's what we are able to do with our opportunities, with our strengths and weaknesses, with where we are today. Now, on the other hand, we look at the 2-talent person and we say, okay, well, he was able to produce 2 more, 5-talent man, 5 more, and yet they got the same commendation. What do we learn from that? Well, number one, we all face distinct circumstances that will alter our talents and abilities. We're going to really speak more on this as we go, but look with me in Luke chapter 21. As we think about Luke chapter 21, Jesus uses an example of someone unlikely from a financial standpoint. Remember, the parable of talents is a financial instrument, but look at what Jesus does here in Luke chapter 21. We're going to cite this a couple times before the lesson's up this morning, but in Luke 21, Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the offering box, and he saw a poor widow and put in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them, for they all contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. I think this is important. Number one, give all that you have. That is a takeaway. But keep in mind, he's saying the rich gave out of what? Their riches. And he didn't say that's bad. He just said that's what they did. She gave out of all that she had. Once again, what is the theme of our lesson this morning? God knows. He knows which talent I am. God also knows what I'm facing. He knows what I'm capable of. Because we have this idea that when we are the widow, as we would say with the 2 mites, we say, well, all I have is just 2 mites. Well, you know what? God knows that that's all she had. And Jesus props her up above those who clearly gave much more. Why is that comforting? Because it's not just about money, of course. God knows when I'm struggling. God knows why I am struggling. He knows what different challenges are on my plate that weren't 5 years ago, that won't be in 10 years. He knows today, tomorrow, and every day that the Lord wills and gives me life, that I face distinct challenges that are mine and mine alone, and that changes how I can serve him. What does that mean? Well, imagine that you work a job that requires 60 hours a week versus 40 hours a week. I would recommend that the person who's working 40 hours a week has 20 extra hours to be productive of some kind. I'm not saying that means 20 hours of being here in the front, praying on the front pew. That's going to make me really uncomfortable during the week when I walk in and see that. But 1 hour wouldn't be bad, right? We have more opportunity. I'm not saying it's wrong to work 60 or more holy to work 40. We're just saying different opportunities, different family structures. Sometimes you reach an age where you're taking care of your parents. That takes more time. That takes more attention. And by the way, 1 Timothy 5 says that is a godly responsibility. You would be pleasing to God by serving your family in that way, by taking care of those who are in need. All of that is different than if everyone in your life is healthy. And if you have a car that you can drive and you don't have to drive far now because COVID changed the whole world and now I work from my house, I have more time to make phone calls, more time to pray, more time to do something that belongs to God. We all have different opportunities. Some of them are difficulties. When we think about abilities, we think just of our strengths or what I'm not good at. The truth is life throws a lot at us, and the question of ability isn't always what I can do, it's what am I facing? We see this in baseball. This congregation is, I know more about football, but in baseball all the time, you get the best hitters and they fail what? Basically 7 out of 10 times. You would be a Hall of Famer of the highest pedigree if you failed 6 out of 10 instead of 4 out of 10. Why? Because it's hard to hit a baseball off of a major league pitcher. It's not because they just forgot how to hit 6 out of 10 times. It's because it's challenging what life throws at you sometimes. And we should take a lot of comfort in knowing that God knows that. And he doesn't hold it against the 2-talent person. He says, I'm going to let you in, but just know this guy's better than you. I'm going to let you in, but it's through the back door. He's getting the main entrance. God knows what my window of opportunity is, for better and for worse. And just like Moses in Exodus 3 and 4 was saying, God, I'm not the person to lead. I can't do this. You picked the wrong guy. I'm not the 5-talent leader that you're calling me to be. Often when we're confronted with God's call to serve at whatever talent level makes you feel best, and that better be the one God thinks of you as, we tend to offer excuses and fear instead of faithfulness. God will call me to do something through his word and what I know is expected of me, and what is my first reaction? That's not for me. Someone can do it better. Someone has done it better. Someone after me will do it better. Someone here could do it better right now. And that may or may not be true. But when we think about being stewards, keep in mind the 5-talent person was able to produce 5 more. The 2-talent person was able to produce 2 more because they weren't competing for the same set resources. Somehow, and even if they were, they managed to work it out to where they both were able to please the master without competing against each other. Too often the excuses we make are someone is better, as if there is a finite amount of opportunities, and you know what? We just got to give the one best person all of them. Well, here's a newsflash. The one person who has everything is a mom, right? You want to get something done, give it to the mom with the long list. But eventually that list does get too long to be fulfilled. Someone has to do something else. In Luke 21, the widow doesn't cry about how poor she is. She just gives all that she has. And isn't it amazing? Isn't it awesome that Jesus sees that and commends her? He doesn't just in quiet think, this is good. She did a good thing. That's what she should do. He tells everyone who's listening, look, you all who are given so much of your abundance, I want you to look at her. The most unlikely person in the room on the property is the poor widow giving 2 mites to be lifted up. And that's exactly who Jesus highlights. Isn't that amazing? God knows when we're poor. He knows when we're struggling. He knows when we're rich. He knows when we're flourishing. And he knows when I'm offering fear as an excuse and when fear is pleasing to him. This is one of the parts of Matthew 25. Look again there. Matthew chapter 25, when the 1-talent person is being grilled for why he didn't produce more, or at least preempting that conversation. Notice what he says in verse 24. Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here, you have what is yours. I didn't take it from you. I just didn't add anything to you. So I was afraid. Again, counts kind of vary based on translation, but it's been said that do not fear, do not be afraid is said in the Bible 365 times, 1 for each day. That is some pretty convenient math if you look at the translations, but it is said a lot. And Jesus teaches that a lot. And Matthew's gospel records Jesus saying, do not be afraid. Do not fear. Don't be afraid. Do not fear them. Do not fear this. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. Fear of the Lord is a good thing. Fear that is debilitating is a failure. And we should take comfort in not that there's failure on the board, not that there's a risk of failure, but that Jesus knows the difference. He knows when there is fear that paralyzes versus fear that propels, right? The question is, if I worry about God, that should make me, number one, study his word more because I know he's a God of love. But number two, that should propel me to more service, not less. And sometimes my fear of not being the best, not being the right person, not having all the requisite skill sets makes me sit on the sideline. And I say, well, I'm not working against it. I'm not going to cause harm. I'm just on the sideline. And unfortunately, you know who that sounds exactly like? The 1-talent man who hid his in the ground. Being the sideline, you're not serving God. That is not going to work. There are no bench warmers who will enter the kingdom of heaven. You are a servant and you do the best you can, whether you're a 1-talent person, a 2-talent person, or, can I just add this please, a 3-talent person? God knows what we're capable of. We don't have to be afraid because we know God is going to give us all the tools and help we need to be successful, not on our merits, but because of how powerful and good God is. So what does that look like? 4 points, the lesson's yours. Number one, because God knows me, I won't waste time comparing myself to others. It's interesting. King Saul in 1 Samuel chapter 17 has a major problem, and that major problem is named Goliath. Goliath will not be taken down. He is taunting his people day after day after day. And we think about it, here is little old David, and he's going to come up, and we always say he's a boy, not quite sure about his age there. But little David versus big Goliath, and he slings that slingshot, kills him, and we say, what a lesson in faith and faithfulness. But notice in 1 Samuel chapter 18, as David is having his flowers, as you might say, the crowd says, Saul has slain his thousands, but David has slain his tens of thousands. And do you want to guess how Saul felt about that? He was furious. It's kind of weird, too, because David actually was defending, can you guess whose nation? Saul as king. His huge problem has just been fixed by the most unlikely source, but his hero is there. Saul's problem is solved, and Saul is focused on what? David is considered better than me. Other people think he's better than I am, and he is just obsessed with that idea. And it debilitates him. I don't think we all have that Saul complex. In fact, I encounter much more, in this day and time at least, people have the opposite. Well, someone is so much better, and so what am I even doing? Why would I even try? Because we have the elders, we have good Bible class teachers like Gary this morning, and Craig and Steve, who's going to teach on Wednesday night in the Psalm class. We have all these people who have so many abilities, and why would I even try? And again, what is that doing? Well, it's that mystery that we said that happened in Matthew 25. If you have kids, you know, they always say, well, that's not fair, this person, that person. You never see that. The 5-talent person just goes and produces 5 more. It shouldn't matter to Saul that David's slain his 10,000s because the crowd has just said Saul has slain his thousands. I understand you might say rhetorically in the Hebrew that was a taunt towards Saul. Number one, I don't think so. But number two, even if it was, did that change that Saul was king? And if he had devoted himself to God, who would have taken care of him? God. It didn't matter what the people thought. God is way stronger than any group of people you'll ever find yourself in front of. I don't compare myself to others because God knows me. It's not about what other people can do. And it's not, by the way, if I'm the 2-talent person, go, whew, at least I'm not the 1-talent person. That guy is a fool. It works every direction. God knows who I am, and so comparing myself to others to make myself feel better or pounding myself into this quote-unquote humble submission, we'll call that for worse, both of them miss the point. I am a steward of what God has given me. Of whom much is given, much is required. Can we extend that? To whom a little is given, a little is required. It doesn't say, if you've been given a little, look at the person who has much. If you have a lot, look down on the person with a little. Focus on Jesus. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 4, we think, how do we get through this life with all of its struggles? And social media has just really added this right in front of our face every single day. Look at everyone's life. Look how good it is. Look how perfect it is. Look how great it is. Look how terrible overseas is, but look how good this is. Everything is the worst or the best at all times. And so I feel like everything is the worst because when it's the worst, it's the worst. And when someone else has it the best, that means I'm the worst. In Hebrews 12, 1 through 4, what was Jesus' secret to enduring the cross and despising the shame? He was looking to the Father. Our faith is to do what? Looking unto Jesus. We're supposed to be fixated on that target in front of us. So I won't compare myself to others because I know God knows me. Also, I will embrace the season of life I am in. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, I think this is interesting. I want to look at these two passages. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5. We mentioned this before, but I want to see it here. I'm going to look at a couple of different verses here in chapter 5. 1 Timothy chapter 5, beginning in verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, has set her hope on God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day, but she who is self-indulgent is dead, even while she lives. Command these things as well, so they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Verse 16, after going through some qualifications of these widows. If any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so it may care for those who are truly widows. One amazing thing about God is he sees that people are going to struggle, and he has systems in place to help you. We say, how does God help us today? His people should help. Do people fail? Yes, I do. Yes, we do. And when I have failed you, I am sorry. Please don't put your faith in me or anyone here. Put your faith in God. And when we execute God's word, what does he say? When someone has family, who takes care of them? Family. The God-given responsibility, family take care of them. If there is no family in the picture, what do we do? Did God forget about them? Not in the slightest. That's when the church should be, to use verse 16 language, burden. That is, take care of this person who has no one else. And can I add as a side note for individuals, the Bible is also very clear in Matthew 25, 31 through 46, and Galatians 6:10. We are to do good to everyone. Yes, especially those of the household of faith, but to everyone as well. God has a plan for taking care of everyone. But I live right now at a time where my parents are in good health. I spend almost no time thinking about if they need anything from me. My sister lives right there. There's a church family right there. They are taken care of. However, that may not always be the case. And I grew up in a house where my grandparents couldn't take care of themselves, so we both sold our houses and moved into one for 7 or 8 years. So I've watched that. And you better believe, and I mean this as loving as possible, that was a strain on everybody's life. That was a lot for mom and dad, for Mimi and Papa, for everyone in the house to now share a house and to have to be taken care of and to take care of someone in addition to teenagers, in addition to jobs, in addition to church work. That is a lot. And as someone like my mom who works so hard and gives 100% all the time, it was very difficult. How do I stop taking care of all these other people in need because I have to be home taking care of, in a good way, my parents who are in need? By the way, the relationship could not be better with everyone in the house. But a burden is that nonetheless. It is a job. It is work. It takes time. When we read 1 Timothy chapter 5, what does God say to do about this? You serve. How do Christians serve? Well, God made me, so we're going to do this. Come on, Grammy, come get your porridge. God says I have to provide. Get down here. 2 more minutes. I've fulfilled my... You serve the best you can. This is what God has put before you. God has said, you have the ability. I have placed you here for this role. We think of Esther chapter 4. Maybe you've been put here for such a time as this. I don't know what season of life you're in, what your opportunities are, what they aren't, what you wish was better, what you wish was the same. But I do know that God is aware of what you're facing. And number one, turn to him for comfort if you're facing a storm. Do not be afraid because Jesus is bigger than the storm. But number two, realize that sometimes you're called to do less of one thing while you're doing something else, and that is biblical. You cannot fulfill 1 Timothy 5, verse 3, 8, and 16, and be doing something that someone faces none of those restrictions is doing at the same time. It's not possible because we're not magical. If I'm serving my family and that's 8 people over here, and someone's serving 1 person over here, this person can do more. That doesn't mean this person is more or less pleasing to God or that I am more or less pleasing to God. It means Jesus knows who I am, what I am called to do in this moment, and I answer to him as a steward of that time and window of opportunity. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that awesome that God knows I don't have to worry about keeping up with what someone else who has a different hand in life is doing? And when you feel overwhelmed and crushed by that, be aware, God sees that. You see this even in Paul's language in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. In light of the present distress, he's telling people, stay single if you can. Why? Because it changes your devotion. When you are married, you are trying to please your spouse, and that is something the enemy could use against you. And yet he doesn't say, by the way, okay, so the conclusion is don't marry. If you want to marry, marry. Just be aware that it changes your circumstance. Don't be afraid or ashamed that you're facing a heavy load or plate. But do be ashamed if you're unwilling to put your hand up to ask for help, because God expects us to help each other. And one of those levers to pull is the person who has less is supposed to do what? Help the person struggling with more. The person who has much in the way of finances, the churches, the individuals in 2 Corinthians 6 through 9, are to help those who have little. We got to make these needs known. God will embrace the season of life I am, but I have to make sure I'm doing that too. God knows me, and because he does, I will do the best I can with everything God has given me. When you think about Colossians chapter 3, whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus. And again, going back to that widow in Luke 21, the poor widow with her 2 mites. She gave all that she had. And it doesn't matter if I think of myself as a 5-talent person, but I would say we do a disservice to ourselves and to God's kingdom by continually placing ceilings on ourselves that God didn't put there. But I don't care what you call yourself. The scriptures say it is my obligation to do the best I can. So whether I consider myself a 1-talent person or a 2-talent person, I have to do the best I can with whatever hand I have. One talent person, do it. We don't give an effort based on how God has sorted us. Isn't that a blessing that God hasn't sorted us that way? Can you even imagine if we knew what kind of talent person we were, what kind of divisions that would create in the church? The Corinthian church was doing that without that distinction drawn. So what do I do then? The best I can with every day. Every person I interact with, that's something God has given me an opportunity to be a steward over, a relationship with this individual. Every opportunity to invite someone to a Bible class that's starting on Wednesday nights to cover the Gospel of John. That's an opportunity that I have for 3 months, and I won't have it in 4 months. We have opportunities that last and those that don't. The tricky part for us is we don't know what will last, if anything. The Lord could come again. Take advantage of the opportunities today. Do everything in word or deed in all in the name of the Lord. And so, because God knows me, I don't have to be afraid. I'm not afraid of being the one talent person and being condemned because I am going to be a steward of what God has given me. I'm going to do the best I can. I know God knows my enemies. God knows my struggles. He knows what season of life I'm in. He knows when my plate is full. He knows when I'm lazy and letting it pretend to be full when it's actually not. God sees it all. I don't have to be afraid unless I actually have something to hide, and then I should be terrified. That is a biblical idea. If you're not pleasing God and you know it, please knock that off. Let's not do that. But for Christians who are trying to put him first, if God knows me, I have no reason to fear. Just like the disciples who saw Jesus walking up to them, what was the first thing? It's a ghost. Do not be afraid. In Matthew 25, I was afraid. It wasn't about the master being a hard man. He was plenty generous to the 5-talent man and the 2-talent man. His expectations were even different. The judge was just, empathetic, and yes, severe. But the severe was the choice of the person who was chosen as a steward, not the master. So our choice today is, do I want to please God or risk his judgment? So if I want to please him, what does that look like? If I never have, I'm going to believe first and foremost that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I'm going to confess my sins. I'm going to confess him as Lord, repenting that my way doesn't work. I've buried my talent. I've selfishly used it. But I haven't put him first. It's time to do that. I'm going to be baptized, having my sins washed away, connecting with the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ himself. Or maybe you're a Christian and we're too often like the 1-talent man and we just fall short for any number of reasons. Isn't it awesome and amazing that God has promised to forgive us of our sins if we confess them? Because he is just and faithful. That is amazing. You don't have to leave in any doubt where you stand with God. It doesn't matter what talent you are. It matters, are you giving God your everything? If you think that's in doubt, let us pray with you and pray for you. If we can help you at all, come.